Lori Sanders, policy analyst for R Street, great organization that is growing at an exponential rate also, and their work is fantastic. I encourage you to look them up.
I think the most interesting part of the conversation in conservatism today is sort of the fight between the reform conservatives on one side and the libertarian populists on the other side. And I think they both have incredibly important things to say, but what I'm really hoping that we'll come to is sort of this synthesis that Ross Douthat seems to be constantly pushing us towards, you know, in the pages of the New York Times. And I'll tell you why I specifically care about it. I care about it because I care about women voters. I think women voters are a huge problem for the GOP. If you look back, I'm sorry, I'm going to bore you with the numbers that I had to write down or else I wouldn't remember them. But women went for Obama in the last election 55-44. Before that, they went for Obama 56-43. In 2004, it was 51-48. In 2000, it was 54-44. In 96, it was 54-38. And this is with like Bill Clinton, who was not so nice to the ladies, if we all remember. So I think that paints, you know, a really overwhelming trend that is really troubling since women now make up the majority of the electorate. And so while I appreciate the arguments that libertarian populism is bringing out, you know, sort of this, the government is against you, the government has created this unequal opportunity, you know, it's crony capitalism, it's special interests, it's corporations, businesses, the government all coming together, it's bigness in general that we should be skeptical of. I think that that's very, very true. But the solution to that at times, to me, seems to be something that's untenable, at least for a lot of the less politically engaged women, you know, not the women that are out in the Tea Party, but just the mom who's in the PTA, who's part of her community, who takes her son to Boy Scouts, right, who really cares about the declining opportunity. I mean, I think it's 2/3 of parents now think that their children have less opportunity than they had when they were growing up. And, you know, a lot of libertarian populist rhetoric comes out very strong in that, you know, the solution is to get rid of the Department of Education. The solution is to get rid of all of these, you know, massive programs. And, you know, women are more risk averse on average. I'm in no way trying to paint, you know, this terrible picture that, you know, women are these little shrews living in their houses or anything, right? But we understand that personality takes place on a spectrum, and women on average tend to have certain types of personality traits more than men. So they are more risk averse. They see things in shades of gray versus in black and white, right? It's a much more nuanced world that women tend to live in. And I think it's somewhat of a scary thing to talk about, we're going to wind down the Department of Education if you're a mother, or if you're, you know, someone who's thinking about getting married and having children, which is still what the overwhelming amount of women are thinking about today, even if they're delaying those decisions until later. So what I'm sort of hoping we will come to is a synthesis between the reform conservatives and the libertarian populists. What the reform conservatives talk about advocating for the most part, you know, this is Ramesh Ponnuru, Yuval Levin, these people who are thinking deep thoughts about how we update the Reagan agenda for today's problems. It's things like Mike Lee's tax plan. You know, Mike Lee is frequently associated with libertarian populists, but his tax plan is something that I think both sides could really get on board with. It takes the problems of women, the middle class, and the lower class seriously, and it's not something that's overwhelming and frightening and has, you know, very strong rhetoric. So I'm hoping that we'll sort of see a synthesis between how do we work within the system that we have today to reform it, which is what, you know, the reform conservatives want, and the libertarian populists, who I think would take more of an extreme angle, specifically because I think it's the only way that you can get sort of the less politically inclined women to come over to your side. So to the extent that we are seeing leadership turn around on its face, that is probably at times a good thing. You know, Tim Kearney had an excellent article in the Examiner, I think it was yesterday, saying that leadership painted themselves into this corner because over decades, not just recently, but over decades, they've promised conservative solutions and not delivered, whether it was Medicare Part D or other things. They said, get in line and we'll get to you. Get in line and we'll get to you. So leadership has certainly painted itself into this corner. But I do think that at times it comes with very negative consequences. You know, Eric Cantor's had all of this effort towards, you know, his Making Life Work campaign. You don't see a lot of things coming out of that. You know, I've been in meetings with Republicans where they fought and squabbled over whether they can support this conservative solution or whether it's going to get them primaried because they can't message it right. And those are, you know, honest conversations to have. But I think that sometimes it gets in the way, you know, the absolute fear of being primaried gets in the way of sort of wanting to go out on a limb and come up with a solution that fits today's times. Women are naturally more empathetic. They have this sense of caring, this sense of nurturing, right? And when you see I mean, to go back to the social media conversation, at least initially we're much better about it now, but initially, you know, all the social media you would see coming out of the right was like this red picture with like red and black, and there's Obama, and it would be like, Obama hates you and is killing your children, right? And like, that's a huge turnoff for women. Or when women hear, you know, Republicans don't care about the poor. There was a great Jonathan Chait headline yesterday about the food stamp vote versus the farm subsidy vote that said, you know, Republicans, we were too nice to poor people, but don't worry, we fixed that, right? And that sort of narrative is incredibly unhelpful. And to some extent, you can't control the liberal media, and that's why social media is such a wonderful thing for letting us take back the narrative to say, like, no, let's explain and have an honest conversation about food stamps and the rise in SNAP benefits. I think that that's something that will continue and will help us win women voters in the future, but it's just something we have to be very careful about as the Republican Party, because I think we can come off as screamy and negative, and we hate illegal immigrants, and we hate immigrants, period, and, you know, we hate poor children. And that's something that, you know, whether you're, you know, a single mother all the way up to like an Ivy League educated woman, that just turns you off.
Ivy League educated women can't be single. Is that what you're saying? No.
Well, if you look at the marriage gap.
Total joke. So I'm going to ask you one question it seems that there is huge energy coming from the outside, forcing change within the conservative movement. But to what degree, and this is a total softball, to what degree do these folks need to make friends, or at least acknowledge the power structure within the establishment?
It's actually not a softball question. I think that's a really tricky thing. That's a really tricky relationship to work. I mean, because it goes back to what I said earlier, that when people have, you know, the fear of God of being primaried, they're scared to do anything. And so to the extent that we see this outrage, or we want to build, you know, I will say on the outrage thing, I think that you can't start with outrage. I think that at least you can, for people who are already engaged, you can totally start with outrage. People that are like, screw the government, it is their fault, I am a libertarian, right? Or whatever, like there is a crowd of people where outrage is a perfectly reasonable starting point. For people who aren't as politically inclined, who are sitting on the fence thinking about these issues, going back and forth, like reading Time magazine or whatever, right? Like, you can't necessarily, you have to have a conversation where you explain what you're about, why you think, you know, this person may be experiencing their problems and frustrations with the state of America today, win them to your side, and then channel them into outrage. That said, you know, we can optimize messages with millions of messages perfectly tailored for little people, because that's like the wonder of the data world that we live in. So I don't think that it has to be one or the other, where we have to live in a world of outrage or a world of not. But back to, once we have people outraged, how do they need to work within Washington? I do think that there needs to be at least a little bit more of an understanding, because you can see it after what happened in 2010. I mean, we only won the House. We didn't win the House and the Senate, and we had no chance of winning the White House, and relatively little has come out of the 2010 Congress. We may win the House and the Senate in 2014, and that would be great, but then we still have a White House to deal with. It is very, very easy for leadership to shut you out. It is very easy for the White House to shut you out. If you're not at least willing to come to the table to some extent, I mean, farm subsidies would have been a great example. It's somewhere that the House could have actually conceded to something that Obama and the Senate Democrats wanted, and that would have been against crony capitalism, yet they were incapable of doing that. So I think that there's...
Your organization, by the way, did some very good work on that, by the way.
And so did you. And so I think it's incredibly important to think about not just how can we apply political pressure for goals that will never be met, like defunding Obamacare, which is a very important goal, but let's face it, is not going to go somewhere during the fall of 2013, to say what are some other places where we can work together within the existing power structure to achieve mutually agreeable goals that you don't have to compromise on. I acknowledge that what you're citing is definitely true. I think that we are, though, making massive inroads. You know, I worked at the American Enterprise Institute for a while. Arthur Brooks's latest book, The Road to Freedom, was all about how we need to change our messaging. You see people talking about messaging in the pages of commentary. And while all of us, you know, sort of DC wonks talk and ponder over messaging strategies, we actually have groups like LIBRE Initiative or Generation Opportunity or Campaign for Liberty who are out there trying to make those changes. I mean, there are so many younger people that I think sort of their establishment population are a bit unaware of, that really do employ interesting messaging strategies. We have a long way to go. I mean, I am keenly aware that we have a long way to go and we're very far behind, but I think it's something that we could be positive about. So I think there are two fronts. I think that policy is a spectrum. I think that the AFPs of the world, the Freedom Works, all of those people are incredibly necessary because they paint an ideal of where we should be, where we would like to go. It's an active base that cares passionately about what they think we should be as a nation. Then there's everyone else. And this is where like the American Enterprise Institutes and groups like that sort of work, which isn't in this like 100 or nothing, you know, like maybe we should take that 10-for-1 tax deal, right? Like because it's unrealistic to think that tomorrow there's going to be a broad enough base supporting AFP, Heritage Action, Freedom Works, as much as I hope they grow. I love these organizations and I hope that they grow and that they expand in support. But you have to work on solutions that are feasible for the immediate term, and Norm is sighing at me right now because I know that he does not like that statement. But I just don't think so. I mean, just because inside of the activists, inside of conservative activists, I was at Right Online 3 weeks ago and had a Florida activist try to explain to me that I needed to help her because FEMA was going to raise her national flood insurance program rates. It's like, keep the government hands off of my Medicare, right? So there's an extent to which rallying the base is incredibly helpful. Then there's also like sort of an extent to which policy is actually made in Washington. And I think we should push that envelope as far as you can in the direction of liberty. But I think that at some point, I wish, so to your original question, I do think that there is an increasing divide inside the conservative movement. I think the RSC is increasingly separated from the rest of the Republican Party, and I think RSC is having trouble within its own ranks because they just kicked Heritage out of the RSC members meeting. Yeah, these are really bad signs if what you want is people to come back together. But in the policy community more broadly, I actually think that we are reaching more towards synthesis once you move away from the Hill. I think that, you know, back to my original statement, I think that Ross Douthat and Ben Domenech actually get closer together every time they write an op-ed about where the conservative movement should go. I think that they are sort of winnowing in on a sweet spot that I'm really, really in favor of. I would like to think that we can get that to people on the Hill. I'm less sure about that because the divide does just seem to be increasing. I do not think that that's helpful. I mean, I think what I find most frustrating about today and the narrative, both in Washington and around the country, is that, you know, I used to be liberal, right? I used to think that the government created, I'm from Macon, Georgia, right? We have a 26% single motherhood rate, a 27% poverty rate, 40% graduation rate in our public schools. These were government created problems by, you know, segregation, Jim Crow law, all sorts of things, right? And in my mind, that meant that the government should fix the problems because the government created the problems. And it, you know, it took some soul searching and a lot of, you know, honest thinking before I realized that really what you want is the most efficient actor to solve a problem, right? And the most efficient actor is very, very seldom going to be the government. And I think that we all agree on that, whether you're a conservative or a libertarian. And I think that the majority of the country actually does agree with that, whether they realize it or not. You know, there's all sorts of polling data that tells you that, you know, people think that problems should be solved at the community level. People are skeptical of government's ability to, you know, save their child's education or, you know, save the people living in poverty in their community. Yet they continually go to government for the answer. And I think a lot of it does have to do both with sort of just the growth of state over time and we become more comfortable with it, but also a lot of today has to do with the negative messaging and the infighting. And, you know, conservatarianism should be this big tent. We do have the answer for Hispanics. We do have the answer for young people. We do have the answer for women who, you know, are being told continually to lean in, lean in. This is the only message you get from the left. But that's like not really what women want. We want to just make our own choices, have children, not have children, go to work, don't go to work, right? Like the left is selling a bill of goods that women don't want, Hispanics don't want, and young people don't want. But I think that we get so focused on this is what that, you know, this is therefore the solution we have to advocate for, that we lose a ton of those people because we lose the respect for their unique individual circumstances. And that's what conservatism is supposed to be about, right? Like it's supposed to be about the individual, yet we don't want to listen to so many individuals from different circumstances who may be able to add something to the policy community. So I think that we need to reach out more. We need to focus more. We need to, you know, practice messaging to, you know, different groups. You know, the good thing about technology today, like I said earlier, is you can send I got tailored messages all the time from Barack Obama at exactly when I was going to read it with exactly what I wanted to read. And we don't really do that in the conservative movement because we don't really care what a lot of people want to read, honestly. And so I think that's one of our biggest problems. And hopefully, I do think there are positive signs. We've talked about them today that is changing. This is just what we need to emphasize going forward.